I'm here with Joel Karsten. He is the author of Straw Bale Gardens, and we're going to ask him some questions about sustainable gardening and a little bit about his personal expertise on straw bale gardening. Tell me a little bit about thistles. The thistles is kind of how straw bale gardening came about.
Well, as a young kid growing up on a crop and dairy farm down in southwest Minnesota, we spent a lot of time as a kid riding on a baling rack, baling hay, baling straw. Once in a while you'd have a broken bale that would get thrown up against the edge of the barn, and over the period of that summer it would get rained on, would get snowed on eventually, and the snow would melt in the spring, and by that time that bale would have turned gray and started to sort of decompose, and you get a couple of thistle seeds that would come that next spring and fall on top of that straw bale, and I would notice how those thistles that would sprout out of those straw bales would be the biggest, tallest thistles on the farm. And I would always inquire with my dad and my grandma, how come that happens? And they would try to explain, there's moisture in there, there's some nutrients as it decomposes, but that bale isn't worth anything to us, let's get rid of it, throw it on the manure spreader, let's haul it out to the field and get rid of it. So essentially I remember that experience, and then fast forward 15 years when I've graduated from the University of Minnesota with a bachelor's in horticulture, and I now understand a little bit more about plant physiology and entomology and what's happening inside of that straw bale as it decomposes. And I bought my first house, and it turns out the house I bought didn't have soil at all. It had about 1.5 inches of topsoil. So I wasn't going to be able to have a garden in that soil. And of course, when you're young, you don't have the money it takes to condition the soil and bring in topsoil, that kind of thing. So I thought about those days when I'd see those straw bales, and I thought, why couldn't I try at least growing vegetables in the straw bales if thistles and ragweeds grew so well out of those decomposing bales, why wouldn't tomatoes grow out of those bales? So I decided to do some experimenting, and as it turns out, it worked really, really well.
Obviously, they're beautiful. In the science of straw bale gardening, what makes it especially sustainable? I mean, and environmentally friendly?
Well, the fact that we're using bales that are produced from a byproduct of the small grains. So oats and wheat are harvested for the purpose of using the seed heads to make oatmeal and make Wheaties and bread flour, etc. And the stalk portion is essentially something that just remains behind as a byproduct. So the farmer's going to bale that up for our use in straw bale gardening, and it's a crop that can be regrown every year, and it's just going to be left in the field if we didn't harvest it and use it specifically for gardening, would just go to waste anyway. So and straw bales break down over a period of a couple years, and when you're done using the bale for gardening purposes, you can finish composting it and till it in, incorporate it into problem areas of your yard where you have too much clay or too much sand, and this organic material will help resolve some of those issues as well. Or you can just use the straw bale compost that you have left over when you're done using it as a compost material to plant annual flowers. I use it in my window boxes and to fill up annual flower pots, that kind of thing. So it makes a great, almost like a potting mix. After it breaks down, that you can continue to use. So you really use it through the whole life cycle, and then it's become soil at the end and it's returned back to Mother Nature. So.
And then there's a specific chemical.
One of the big advantages of straw bale, using straw bales, is that we're building brand new soil inside of this bale every year. In traditional gardening, if you plant the same crops anywhere in the same soil, you're going to get a buildup, an exacerbation of problems with insect and disease that affect that particular plant. And over a period of years, that disease problem is going to get worse and worse. You're going to end up having to use some sort of pesticides, more than likely, to prevent those problems. Where with straw bale gardening, we don't have to worry about that because we're building brand new soil inside of this bale every year. So our plants are growing in virgin soil inside of this bale. So there's no carryover of insect or disease problems from one year to the next. It makes it much less likely that you're going to have major problems with disease and insects in your vegetable crops.
Okay, and then we're talking about, and what about, and talking about insect control, what about the trellising of certain...
When we use vertical gardening, it really has an impact on how your plants grow in a number of ways. One thing is, when you get crops that are already started 20 to 22 inches up off the ground on top of a bale, and then you can trellis or build some type of a espalier wire system above that straw bale to hold the vegetation up above the bale, it tends to prevent insects, because what insects like is to be on vegetation that's close to the ground, that's crowded, where it doesn't get a lot of airflow and wind movement, where it's nice and shady.
And they can hide.
Right, that's where they like to hide and hang out. If you stretch that vegetation and that green matter up in the air and get it growing more vertical, the insects are going to be less drawn to that area. There's more airflow, there's more sun. It's just not a comfortable place for them to be. So a good example I always use is potato vines. Normally potato vines we just let flop over on the ground, and potato bugs love to hide underneath those potato vines on the bottoms of the leaves, so they're hard to detect. If you train those potato vines up on an espalier wire, sometimes that means having to tie them up a little bit, it makes it a less desirable place for those potato bugs to hang out. And it makes it real easy to find them and physically remove them if they do come and infest your plants.
Oh, that's just fantastic. And speaking of being up, one of the benefits, even just like body kinetics or ergonomics, is to have, you've got a bale that is already 22 inches above the ground. So
yeah, it makes a real big difference for anybody who wants to get involved in gardening and has any kind of physical limitation. Sometimes that means just a knee problem or a back problem where you can't bend over and get down on the ground. But as we all get older, and the seasoned gardeners that have been doing this for a while, you understand how difficult and how physical gardening can be when you have to dig up the soil to plant, dig up the soil to harvest. Soil weighs about 80 pounds per cubic foot, so it's heavy stuff to move around. If you're up off the ground and you don't have to get down on the ground, you don't have to dig up the soil to plant, you can simply plant into that 22-inch tall straw bale. It makes it much easier, much more accessible for everyone as they get older, or if you have any kind of physical limitations. It's a wonderful way for people who happen to be confined to a chair, wheelchair, to be able to garden, because you can do this on any surface. It doesn't have to be in an existing garden. It can be on a hard concrete or a paver parking lot or a asphalt parking lot, and still be able to wheel a chair up and down in between there and have it be 22 inches off the ground without all the expense of building raised beds and having to transition a whole part of a yard to permanent raised beds. This is something that could be temporary if you wanted to use it over short term. If it was a rental property, for instance, it can be used over short term to make these essentially raised beds out of straw bales, and then be able to get rid of them very easily if you decide not to do it.
all right. And then we were talking about ease, just there a little bit about ease and space. You have currently a 20 bale.
21, I think.
21.
21 bales I have just a little tiny lot, but even my 21 bales takes up a space about 30 feet wide by about 20 feet deep. So it's not a huge area that you have to commit to gardening. Just like a traditional soil garden, you'll get about the same productivity per square foot, pretty close. Maybe a little bit more productive using the straw bale garden method than using traditional soil, but essentially it takes about the same space to get about the same amount of production.
And speaking of productivity, do you have, in your opinion, what's some of the best vegetables, or do you have a favorite?
Well, tomatoes. Everybody loves to grow tomatoes, but growing tomatoes in straw bales is really a phenomenal way to grow tomatoes. Because vine crops like tomatoes are so sensitive to verticillium wilt and other fungal diseases, septoria leaf spot, etc. If you have problems in your soil, it's to your detriment to plant tomatoes in that same soil for any period within 5 years of when you've seen that occurrence. With straw bale gardening, you don't have to worry, because we're going to plant them in a bale, and that bale has never seen a tomato before. It's brand new virgin soil, so there's no presence of disease, no fungal problems in that bale that are harbored from one season to the next. So it's a very sterile way to grow tomatoes very successfully, particularly the heirloom varieties that tend to be more disease sensitive than some of the hybrid varieties. If you've never grown them, you need to try some hybrid, some of the heirloom tomatoes in your straw bales, because you'll be successful. Everybody who tries it is amazed by how well they grow. Yeah. And potatoes is another crop that I think they do really well in straw bales, and people are always amazed how easy they are to plant, how easy they are to harvest, with no fork marks or shovel marks.
Your blog has that wonderful picture of the potatoes and how easy they are to harvest.
Yeah, you can get pretty near a bushel of potatoes out of one nice sized bale. So it's a very productive way to grow potatoes as well. And you grow other things on that same bale during the season until harvest time. Late in the season, then it needs to be just potatoes.
How many items per bale
It all depends on what you're planting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing carrots, you're going to have 48 to 60 carrots on a bale. If you're growing tomatoes, 2 tomato plants is gonna draw a lot of moisture out of that bale during the month of August. So I usually recommend, if they're really big varieties of tomatoes, to just do 1 in a bale, and then other crops as well. But remember, you can plant the sides of the bale as well as seeding and direct planting the top of the bale.
Okay.
So we're putting herbs and your squash plant right in the side of the bale, where your beans and peas are being seeded on the surface of the bale.
Okay,
a little
wonderful.
layer of potting mix on the surface. So we keep everything nice and sterile, so there's never any weed problems in our straw bales, which is one of the other big advantages of straw bale gardening, is that there are no weeds.
That is fantastic. Part of in your speaking and communication, when you're speaking to people who live in suburban and urban areas, what do you find that they kind of typically see as their biggest roadblock?
Number one thing is soil. Everybody says, I live in a urban area and I just don't have the soil to have a good garden. Well, that excuse is out the window now, because literally, if you have a sunny spot and you have access to a garden hose, you can have a garden. You don't have to have soil at all. As I said earlier, you can do this in a corner of a parking lot if you were so inclined. But if you just have an area, you have to have full sun if you're going to grow vegetables. It really is important that you have a nice sunny area. As long as you have sun and access to water on a fairly regular basis, preferably a daily basis during the hot part of the summer, you can grow a garden there. Now, the other limitation for many urban gardeners is just simply a lack of knowledge. And this tends to come from being separated from gardening for at least a generation, or sometimes multiple generations, that nobody in the family has ever had a garden. So what they know about gardening is, what they can read in a pamphlet or read in a book. And that can be difficult, because starting a garden, for anybody who's been a long-term vegetable gardener, there's a big commitment to having a garden.
Absolutely.
And very often people dig up that area of their yard where they think they're going to plant their garden, and it looks really nice, and they get all their rows made, and they get their seeds planted, and 3 days later, it's like this whole garden is growing hair. The weeds just start to come everywhere, and they get, confused. What is the plant I planted, and what is this thing that's coming up? And so they kind of don't pull any of the weeds until they get a little bigger, and then by the time they start pulling the weeds, the roots of the weeds are tangled with the roots of their vegetables, and then it kind of destroys the plants as you pull them out. And by July 1st, everything is all weeds and it's waist high, and they throw in the towel and they say, well, I gave it an effort, but it didn't work for me.
Right.
With straw bale gardening, you eliminate that, because there aren't going to be any weeds. So whatever you plant is the only thing essentially that's going to come up out of that bale. So it makes that part of it much easier, and it eliminates the frustration that people have with all the weeds and all the labor that's involved. This just makes it a much easier, friendlier way to garden, and eliminates about 75% of your actual labor input from the gardening process. So even though you have a little investment up front in buying the straw bales, I tell people that's a much lower investment than your overall investment to labor in a typical garden.
Monetarily,
yes, exactly.
Much different.
Time is money, and you
absolutely.
Save lots of time.
And speaking of time, in wrapping this up, what would you say is the biggest benefit that people are going to reap? I mean, aside from just the vegetables, even personally, what do you feel it fulfills?
Well, gardening is a wonderful thing for anybody to participate in. It's a great hobby. It's a great way to save money, and you know where your vegetables are coming from. You know where your source of produce is coming from. So that's a wonderful thing for anybody to get involved with, and to get your kids involved with. Sort of a little soapbox I always like to get on is the fact that society has trained many of us, when we go to the grocery store, if we see a tomato at the grocery store and it has one little blemish on it, we'll leave that tomato and we'll buy the perfect tomato over here.
Right.
And so eventually that tomato goes back to the distributor, and the distributor goes back to the grower and says, don't send me any more tomatoes that have any blemishes on them, because I end up getting them back. Nobody wants to buy those. Well, if you grow your own tomatoes in your own garden and it has a little tiny blemish on it, and you spent all summer growing it, I assure you, you're going to just cut the blemish off and you're going to still eat the tomato.
Right.
And then you're going to realize that you didn't die from eating a tomato that had one little blemish, and hopefully that will help change people's opinions and attitudes towards what we buy through our food chain. And we'll go to the grocery store and we won't be so turned off by one tomato that has a little tiny mark on it. And that can influence our entire food supply chain. right now we throw away about 35% of all produce that's grown gets thrown in the garbage by the growers because the produce isn't perfect for the consumer. Consumers are so trained now to only buy that perfect cucumber, that perfect tomato. And I think if we grow our own, at least part of our own food supply, it can really, from a foundation, from a grassroots level, can help change that attitude. And I think have a really big impact on society in general, hopefully make us all more healthy, all more knowledgeable about where our food comes from, and maybe save a little bit of money in the long run as well.
All right, Joel, thank you for your time today.
You're very
It was
welcome.
fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.